Pronto. Estamos gravando de novo.
Gente, vamos retomar então. A gente vai ter agora a apresentação do professor Pedro Paulo Pimenta, da FFLCH aqui da USP, e ele vai apresentar, então, uma apresentação intitulada Natural Selection and Technical Analogy, Darwin and the Heritage of the Enlightenment.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation and for the opportunity of being here. And I have changed the title of my presentation, in fact, the subtitle. Now it's called Darwin on the Structure of the Eye, because it is about that, and that involves the heritage of the Enlightenment. Well, I have a few preliminary words because when João invited me, I thought it was a very good opportunity to expose a question, the question of final causes in biological thought, not in biology, biological thought, that has become once again relevant in philosophy. I do not think that the experimental sciences have a need. They do need a critique of teleology nowadays. Since to my knowledge, I don't know if I'm correct, but to my knowledge, not only do they work outside the frame of teleological references, they also avoid it carefully. But for a number of reasons, it happens that philosophy nowadays finds itself entangled with what from the outside would look like a question that is not relevant anymore, the question of final causes. My idea then is to go back to the past, to a very well-known passage in The Origin of Species, in order to give a few references for a critique of final causes. So this is part of a larger work that I am doing at this moment. And I should say that my idea is to give philosophers an idea of the I will call it the Darwin effect in its original form. That is to say, this effect in its immediate exposition in The Origin of Species. And before I go on reading my paper, I would like to say that the point of view from which I do this, although the discussion is conducted in English, and I will speak primarily about Darwin, Kant, and Hume, my point of view is French, in the sense that the methodology that I use in my researches comes from Canguilhem, bien sûr, Foucault, and also Lebrun. This is a completely normal thing for someone who works in the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of São Paulo, who has been, as is well known, a center of diffusion and discussion of French philosophy. Well, so I'll read the paper, and it's going to be quite different, but I think. The idea that the form of an organ or part of an organism ought to be explained in terms of the function it performs is one of the oldest in biological thought. It dates back to Aristotle and was widely used in modern times between the 17th and the 19th centuries. However, there are important dissenters. In antiquity, the atomistic physics of Lucretius, among the moderns, the pantheism of Spinoza. As is well known, Darwin himself criticizes the functionalist thesis and postulates that function is contingent in relation to form. The argument is set out on chapter 6 of The Origin, when he discusses the anatomy of the eye. As we shall see, this example has a history. Both Kant and Hume use it to challenge the use of teleological arguments in philosophy, and they are not concerned directly, but they are not concerned directly with natural history as such. On the contrary, Both of them think that naturalists have the right to use final causes whenever it suits them in order to explain phenomena that otherwise would remain elusive. Darwin's critique comes from an altogether different place. He treats the problem of the shape of the eye in relation to the idea of a final cause in the context of a new theory, that of natural selection, in the positive sense, and gives it a new and original meaning. A well-known passage in The Origin of Species from chapter 6 states that, I quote, you know that very well, the supposition that the eye, with its inimitable devices for adjusting the focus at different distances, admitting varying qualities of light, and correcting spherical and chromatic aberrations, could have been formed by natural selection, is absurd in the highest degree. At first sight, this chapter is devoted to the difficulties of the theory of natural selection. The section that interests us in particular deals with extremely complicated and perfect organs. Darwin wants to show that a perfect structure, like the eye of an eagle, for example, is not to be explained as the effect of a final cause, but rather as the result of a process of conversion of a simple apparatus of an optic nerve into something like a very efficient optical instrument. This conversion is to be understood in terms of historical development. True at first glance, it seems absurd to suppose that something so admirable and almost perfect could be formed without intention or a plan. For Darwin, however, the eye of an eagle is not the inevitable outcome of empirical process. Its conversion from an apparatus into an instrument is not the result of design, but of circumstances. That is to say, it is a rational structure that doesn't have a rational principle. As he states in chapter 6, the present forms of living beings are the results of a history of millions and millions of years, in which internal structures adapt to conditions of existence by means of selection. This process seems to have occurred through gradual transitions and would proceed without leaps. I remind you that one of Darwin's favorite adages is scholastic, and as Canguilhem says, was also used by Kant, natura non facit saltum. That comes from medieval philosophy. Thus, if every complex organ is the product of natural selection, there could not be an organ of this type that occurred immediately with its current structure. In this theory, the very idea of creation becomes useless. Whether the form of the eye of the eagle responds or answers to any purpose whatsoever is entirely contingent. Other similar but not identical forms respond to the same purpose, that is to be sensible to light, which Darwin takes as an imperative common to the survival of many different forms of life. In order to be sensible to light, it's not strictly necessary to have an eye. That's what he says. However, it is hard to let go of functionalist explanations and the teleological prejudice that attends it. As any reader of Aristotle knows, the idea of a necessary connection between a useful function and a given form seems perfectly reasonable and works within when applied to taxonomy via comparative anatomy. For then, the idea of a design becomes pertinent to understand differences and similarities among forms, and we are like to think in terms of final causes, even if we don't reflect consciously on them. Commenting on this point, Kant, the German philosopher, states, I quote, that all the natural disposition of a creature are destined to develop completely and in accordance with an end. And he justifies this statement by appealing to the practice of anatomists and physiologists. I quote, in all animals, this is confirmed both by external observation and by internal or anatomical observation. Would that be enough to take this pragmatic principle as a philosophical one, or as a rational principle of constitution of experience? Not at all. From the fact that it is useful for scientists, it does not follow that it is legitimate in philosophy. Kant clarifies the point, and I quote the critique of judgment. He says, when, for example, we mention the anatomy of a bird, the hollowness of its bones, the position of the wings in view of flight, that of the tail in view of direction, etc., we say without having to resort to a special kind of causality according to ends, what they call in Latin nexus finalis, that everything here is highly contingent according to the nexus effectivus of nature. So there is an opposition between final causes and effective causes, efficient causes. This means that nature, says Kant, considered as a simple mechanism, could have formed things in 1,000 other ways without having found unity precisely according to such a principle, and therefore it would not be expected that the slightest a priori reason for this would be found in the concept of nature, but only outside of it. That is to say, all that exists in nature, when viewed with due care, are effective connections which point to the contingent formation of certain products as organized forms. And the fact is that if we were to treat of a bird, for example, in Cartesian fashion as a simple machine, we would have no difficulty in explaining the mechanism of its functioning or in finding relationships between the various springs and levers that compose it. It is an analogy, of course. Even so, we would remain at a loss when it comes to the question of why such a form is necessary and could not be otherwise. It is then in the face of contingency that final causes all of a sudden at least seem to become pertinent. And I quote Kant once again in the Critique of Judgment. He says, when it is said that the crystalline lens in the eye has the purpose of, by a second refraction of the light rays, once again effecting the unification of those emanating from a point, at a point of the retina in the eye, it is only said that the representation of an end is the causality of nature in producing the eye, and it is thought of because such an idea serves as a principle to guide the investigation of the eye with respect to the part of it mentioned. It would be a constitutive principle. That is the question. From the fact that you identify a sort of intentionality in a structure, it does not follow that it is made or it was framed in accordance with a rational principle. Kant is very careful with his arguments, and he chooses his example with craft. Indeed, the question of the form of the eye could not be more pertinent, for it concerns a mechanism that belongs to the domain of optics, a Newtonian science, and yet raises the problem of the relations of mean to ends, which is absent from Newtonian science in the strict sense. When confronted with an organ that performs a function in the manner of an instrument, human reason is proper to ask, what is this for? The answer to which, in anatomy, is always the same, for such and such a use or effect. For Kant, this answer is not wrong in itself, but it's partial, and as such, it is insufficient. It only explains the way in which the naturalist is obliged, by the structure of his reason, rational faculty, to speak about things rather than the way things are in themselves. It is human reason that proposes the analogy between products of art and natural forms, or as Kant puts it rather bluntly, it is reason itself that introduces final causes in the perception of things otherwise deprived of them. As far as I know, Darwin never read Kant. That would go some way to explain why he states, rather carelessly, that to believe that a perfect and complex eye is formed by natural selection, the reader must strive to overcome his imagination with the force of his reason. His precise words are these: his reason ought to conquer his imagination. As if it were a mere question of fancy, and not, as Kant states, an illusion that is in a manner constitutive of human reason. Darwin, however, soon overcomes this leap and recognizes that the analogy between the shape of the eye and man-made objects is almost inevitable. I quote, "It is practically impossible not to compare the eye to a telescope. We know that this instrument has been perfected by long and continued efforts of human intellects of the highest caliber, and it is natural to infer that the eye has been formed by a process in some way analogous." Darwin alludes here to a type of analogy common in the rites of rational theology, such as those of William Paley. They belong to established genre and tradition that harks back to the Boyle lectures inaugurated in the Royal Society of London in the early 18th century. These were dedicated to the propagation of natural religion, system of religious belief, supposedly based on reason, or more precisely, on Newtonian natural philosophy. That is a system of religious belief that takes the supposed order of natural things as a sign that they were ordered by an intelligence. The most incisive critic of this kind of argument was David Hume. Again, I do not know whether Darwin had Hume or not, but his importance to Darwin's theory is undeniable. As Michael Ruse says, Hume's ideas played a decisive role in the controversies that steered Darwin's reception in English scientific and intellectual circles. And we can add that none other than Huxley wrote an apology for his thoughts. In the dialogues concerning natural religion, which were published in 1778, Hume invites us, I quote, to consider the eye anatomically, to examine its structure and contrivance, and tell me from your sentiment whether the idea of a contriver does not immediately impose itself upon you with a force similar to that of a sensation. But he goes on to show that this sentiment of a contriver from the contrivance is a kind of an illusion. It is, to be sure, a constitutive illusion in the sense that it is an illusion. This is a way of reasoning that was acquired and given sense by intellectual attitudes and by systems of philosophy and of science, but it does not mean it is true. As Hume explains, the attribution of a common end or purpose to organized bodies is a kind of subreception of human imagination that tends to apply the scheme of human technical invention to living things as if they were man-made machines, or rather, as if organisms were living machines. This latter idea had been a source of some of the most inventive and fascinating modern theories concerning organic form. Leibniz, for instance, speaks of machines of nature, divine machines, and uses many other such epithets so as to make clear that the analogy, although it involves things of different classes, natural things, artificial things, divine things, is perfectly valid and indeed offers a rather precise concept in the scope of a metaphysics of natural order. Hume thinks that such analogies, when applied to natural history and taken with a pinch of salt, can at best be pertinent and are at worst harmless. That is not the case when a metaphysician uses them, for now they imply an inference that since organisms are machines, they would also be the product of design that does not stand the test of reason. Hume insists that from a logical point of view, there is no parity between objects that are produced with intention and design and things that are the result of natural processes. And when we say that nature or God has made things such as they are, according to a plan or necessity, this is nothing more than a manner of speak, a grammatical license that does not have any conceptual value whatsoever. In my sense, and I think it is supported by the reading of the texts, this human critique, the critique of final causes by David Hume, is very important to Darwin, because when we come to the passage in which he discusses the eye, and which you all know very well, that's the question of analogy that serves as his, that we find in the fulcrum of his considerations. Darwin himself, although he is very careful not to enter into metaphysical conundrums, makes the same point as Hume in chapter 6 of The Origin of Species, and takes it straight to the realm of theology, when he says, have we any right to suppose that the Creator operates with intellectual power like those of man? I will not quote the passage because it is very well known. The important thing to me is to say that Hume questions the analogy of living beings to products of human art. Darwin presupposes the same analogy to show what it would imply, the intervention in natural selection of something like a plastic nature, or a subordinate power, obedience to a divine intellect in the formation of living things. That would be, in effect, for Darwin, the only coherent conception of something akin to the divine art. Nature as a craftsman subordinates to it, who supervises step by step, in the smallest details, a process marked by circumstances and variations that seem unpredictable. In short, to speak of a divine technique to explain the shape of the eagle's eyes, by natural selection, is to make the latter, natural selection, a subsidiary agent. Darwin, however, has his own conceptual strategies. In the passage that interests us, he personifies natural selection as if it had a kind of voluntary activity. He says, for example, that natural selection will pick out with unerring skill each improvement. A phrase whose correct, simple meaning amounts to this: natural selection is the acquisition and transmission, amid circumstantial variations, of subtle improvements that occur over time in the organs of different species of living things. In other words, and in purely metaphorical terms, it is nothing less than a blind agent. If we may add, this is a phrase more subtle than Dawkins' blind watchman, which implies the idea that living things are something like clockworks or machines, when Darwin asks us to think in other terms, reversing the analogy and suggesting that human technical activity is a function of natural production and not the other way around. With this, I'm coming to the conclusion of my exposition. Victorian England was, of course, unprepared to take a theory such as this. And this is interesting because it was perfectly reasonable, for instance, to be an atheist in France around the same time, but in England, it was impossible. I don't know if it was the revolution or the materialists, but in any case, when Hume was, for example, was translated in France, the French materialists thought his considerations were too timid. And in Victorian England, Hume was a bit of no-go area to any decent person. For this theory, Darwinian theory, indeed, has really consequences for the idea of a natural religion. That said, Darwin, like the Enlightenment philosopher who preceded him, was not an irreverent writer and was willing to preserve certain values dear to natural religion. Let us not forget, the author of The Origin of Species was the same man who wrote The Descent of Man. In this latter work, the figure of man, barely present in the first book, takes central stage. Endowed with a faculty that apparently places him above other living beings, he is now a moral animal. And he says, I fully subscribe to the judgment of those writers who maintain that of all the differences between man and the lower animals, the moral sense of conscience is by far the most important. This sense, as Mackintosh remarks, and he quotes, has a rightful supremacy over every other principle of human action. It is summed up in that short but imperious word, ought, so full of high significance. It is the most noble of all the attributes of man, leading him without a moment's hesitation to risk his life for that of a fellow creature, or after due deliberation, impelled simply by the deep feeling of right or duty to sacrifice it in some great cause. This convoluted piece of reasoning that would be a shock to a prudent philosopher like Hume is then followed by a quotation of Kant's famous passage in a critique of practical reason on the sublimity of moral law. But our naturalist also is cautious. Instead of insisting on the idea of man's superiority over what he calls lower animals, Darwin offers a rather more nuanced consideration and says, the following proposition seems to be in a high degree probable, namely that any animal whatsoever endowed with well-marked social instincts, the parental and filial affections being here included, would inevitably acquire a moral sense of conscience as soon as its intellectual powers have become as well or nearly as well developed as in man. End of quotation. Given certain conditions, any animal could acquire the same distinctive moral Kantian mark that currently, that is to say, at this present juncture in the history of the development of organic forms, elevates man above other species. Or rather, given these conditions, an animal species would necessarily acquire these distinctive traits. That is to say, all animals that would attain to the same level of complexity as man would be entitled to be considered humans, a dubious distinction in the light of certain recent events. As to the precise meaning of terms such as moral sense, this is not a place to inquire into them, but that is a complex and interesting question. Why a naturalist would feel compelled to use moral sense? But then, why take the moral sense as the criterion for determining the superiority of one form of life over another? Wouldn't this be a concession to the apologists of the idea that nature is ordered for the best and that man occupies its center? After all, if living beings, as they become more complex, acquire compassion or sympathy, this might as well be a sign that in spite of appearances and everything that is said about the struggle for existence, nature is a beneficent power that attains a kind of perfection in the way it selects and transmits organic forms. In view of this, Kant and Hume would be entitled to see Darwin's theory with some reservations. For the very criterion of perfection is, after all, an artistic one. To say that there are forms that attain a certain level of perfection that puts them above others is to think in terms of the dreaded teleological analogy. Nature as art, and thus endowed with a certain demiurgic quality, and one that operates within a moral human scope. That said, our philosophers would also be wary of taking this as far as concluding that natural selection is nothing but a timid version of the old teleology. They would rather note that the important clause in the text just quoted from Descent of Man is precisely this: any animal whatsoever. It suggests that Darwin's theory is entirely based on hypothetical explanations, and thus we arrive at the core of his conceptual thinking. The use of hypotheses as principles, the recourse to conjecture as the logical tool par excellence, and the establishment of necessary truths in the sense of probable truths. In other words, Darwin as a perfect Newtonian in the strict sense. This represents nothing short of a revolution in the realm of biological thought, but also in philosophical terms, Darwin thus arrives at a prodigy. With the emphasis on moral sense, he values the Kantian heritage in equating the necessary with the probable, he confirms human epistemology. Thank you. Eu prefiro aí em inglês.
Perguntas?
I'd like to start with a parentheses. Having frequented Maria Alicia's class on the origin of species, my loyalty is divided because because Pedro is my advisor. But the issue of teleology in biological thought is something that has interested me for quite a long time. I ultimately decided that it was too complicated to focus on it in my thesis. But I have swung between the poles, between Maria Alicia and Pimenta for some time now. And
I think you should stick with her. It's more.
well, that's too bad because I've now swung back to your position.
We'll fix that.
And I think that the most, what's that?
Nobody's perfect.
The most clear illustration of this complex way in which we think about teleology and biological thought was captured in the introduction to a book written, to me at least, a book written by Samir Okasha, Agents and Goals in Evolution, in which we express the traits of organisms, and we always resort to teleological language to do so. But that teleological language can always be reframed in terms of an efficient causal process in which advantageous mutations arise, and the organisms that happen to have them will survive and pass that on to their offspring. So we can always take the teleological tip of the iceberg, but reframe it in terms of the efficient causal process that Darwin argues for. But I'm not sure if we can do the reverse and explain the efficient process in teleological language in a way that goes beyond merely a heuristic or didactic explanation.
Because if you do that, you would arrive at the metaphysics of nature.
Mm-hmm. So I don't think that we can.
If that's what you want, that's perfectly. For example, in phenomenology nowadays, that there is a lot of discussion. So this is written against this kind of thing. There are a lot of discussions concerning not only the use of final causes as legitimate and necessary in order to explain living forms. The use of anti-Darwinian arguments, which is a bit shocking, but it's that this use is becoming each day more spreading. And finally, the defense that the idea that in order to have a completely coherent teleological system, it would be necessary to understand science in the framework of a metaphysics of nature. And I find this personally, all of these points, they're all shocking to me. So perhaps I'm overreacting, you see, but that's the idea, is to contest, is to question the legitimacy of this philosophical project.
So that was just my parentheses. I would be very short in my question, but as someone who's been studying analogy in Darwin, this was a very significant talk. Chapter 1 of The Origin of Species uses domestic animals and cultivated plants as a way to shed light on animals and plants in the wild. And here the difference is not very significant, because according to Darwin, domesticated animals and cultivated plants are merely varieties of wild animals and plants. But in chapter 6, there's an interesting leap in which the comparison is not between organisms, it's between an organism, or an organ rather, and an artifact. And we frequently talk about the way that the telescope can be used to understand the eye, but we forget about the other way around, where the eye is also helping us understand the way the telescope emerges, and that speaks to the illusion that Hume is talking about between the contriver that leads to the contrivance. Darwin's explanation is that there is no contriver. This is a historical process, and it's taking place over historical time. That's how telescopes emerge.
That's what I said, no?
Yes, we're in agreement here. However, there's something that, and I'm citing you, and I took the liberty of translating it into English. This is from your Trama da Natureza.
It's quoting me in English, and I wrote them in Portuguese.
The technical analogy allows Darwin to take the process of natural selection as a case of the model of artificial selection, with the difference that while the latter is guided by a human purpose, the former has no telos, it is blind. This is an elucidating difference which makes the analogy not only interesting from a heuristic standpoint, but also useful from a conceptual perspective. It teaches us to grasp a heterogeneous element between the natural and the human. But is it really all that heterogeneous?
I concur with that.
You concur with but is it really that heterogeneous? Aren't these processes actually much more similar?
They're heterogeneous from the point of view of rational principle, because the world has a rational principle. It's governed by utility, and it's governed by means that are established by human beings, be it communities or individuals. And the other is it's totally blind. And it shows, in my view, it shows us two things. The first thing is heterogeneity, because one is intentional, the other is non-intentional, but also it forces us to think that these intentional processes, they're much less rational in the sense of a preview, a design, than they appear at first sight.
They're less heterogeneous than
in that sense.
Can I ask for a clarification, please? Which process you say is not intentional? That
Natural selection.
Natural selection.
Natural selection is not
Artificial
intentional.
selection.
Artificial selection is intentional.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was wrong.
No, I'm all for natural selection in the positive sense.
Right. Mhm.
So I'm not sure if we agree or not, but
I think we disagree a little bit. That's the conclusion. Is that to me,
that's
the
interesting.
natura non facit saltum maxim.
That's the sense.
To me, we always think of that in the geological sense in Darwin. We think about it in the biological sense. We don't think about it in the cultural sense. And I think that this analogy helps establish that human reason, human art, and human culture also abide by the natura non facit saltum.
From art to culture, you were making a leap. Art. Sorry. But my sense, there's a big difference
Between,
art and culture.
there absolutely is, but, okay,
So you have to show that.
okay.
You know, this is-
Well, if no one has a question, I would like to take the occasion to have a more general question, because you talked about a human epistemology of Darwin. I'd like to know if you think that a Kantian epistemology is possible in a sense, because as you said, in chapter 6, he said he took this kind of human question, or human reason cannot reach the what is the divine intellectual, etc. But negative theology also does this in some sense. You should not deny the reality of something. You say this is not accessible by reason, right? And in some sense, this is Kantian. And if you see Darwin's letters, I'm taking here a more broad general. He says, well, the complexity of the world, I cannot imagine
He has a
this.
negative theology.
Sorry?
He has a negative theology.
Well, I mean, isn't a kind of agnosticism in the sense of an epistemology of its limits? I mean, my question would be, couldn't it be more Kantian than human in the sense that Darwin accepts that reality? And,
I didn't know that. So surely it is.
Okay. Okay.
I wasn't aware of his saying that in his letter.
Well, in the letters, he says things as this. I cannot explain how such a complex word is so. And so he says I should limit myself to not knowing how does it can go, right? It's a skepticism, but it's a limit of reason.
I think if you don't choose between his being a disciple, a philosophical disciple of Hume or of Kant, you could say his disciple of Newton.
Okay.
Because that's Newtonian. In the optics, you find that. In the Principia, you find that.
Okay. Okay.
It is incumbent of a science to describe things.
And not making hypotheses in the sense of...
It's making hypotheses in the empirical sense of experimental science, even in the realm of concepts. But it is wrong to think that this kind of activity might give us some glimpse of some supposed different level of reality.
Great.
So if you say, for example, that there is something, but I don't have the means to explain it, that's a negative theology. But it would be more strict to say that, more rigorous. From the point of view of my science, the idea that there is something, or the idea that the world has an order, is plainly useless or bizarre. So that's the difference between Kant and Hume.
Okay. Thank you.
Mais alguma questão? Thank you, Professor Pedro.
Thank you very much.
So we have a half an hour break. There is coffee in the room 3, just there. We don't have water, so for those of you who have bottles, we ask you to take there. And we have just some bottles here if someone wants water and does not have it.
And then we come back at
at 11:10. So half an hour.